Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily video update for December 7th, 2022. Today I'm going to present something which in reality is good news. Now, I know many of you are not inclined to look for good news because you've been so depressed by developments in recent months and years, and you've been conditioned to think that there's no possibility for there to be a positive change. But it's occurring. It's occurring out in the open. It's just not reported to you. And there are increasing signs of desperation among the existing oligarchical controllers of the collapsing unipolar order. And I'll present some of those, but I'll also give you the indications that short of nuclear war, there's no way they can stop this transformation away from the so-called unipolar rules-based order. Now, first, let's start with the fact that there have been missile attacks or perhaps drone attacks on Russian airfields in the last days. This is desperation. And if in fact this is the Ukrainian military that's doing it, they're inviting an escalation from Russia, which will not be pleasant for Ukraine. We saw the indications for this in the NATO foreign ministers meeting last week in Bucharest, where they laid out a strategy for permanent warfare, which they can't afford to conduct. They're running out of weapons. Their economies are in terrible shape. The NATO economies are crashing. The population is restive in these countries. So how do they intend to continue this? Well, we see the intention to continue it in the comments of the Muddleheaded Secretary of State, and I'm using Muddleheaded as a polite term. He's actually virtually an evil satanic figure who's supporting sanctions that are killing large numbers of children, while he professes to feel the pain of those children when he looks in his own children's eyes. Well, I don't believe him. I think he's a protege of Madeleine Albright, who said calmly that 500,000 Iraqi children killed by sanctions in the 1990s was a good price to pay to remove Saddam. Now, Blinken told a conference 2 days ago that there is, quote, no off-ramp, unquote, for Russia. And he said that he would not accept Russian terms for a diplomatic solution. Instead, it's up to Kiev to decide when the war will end. He said, quote, Ukrainians are making the decisions about what they want, unquote. Well, that's simply not true. Ukrainian puppets are being told what they want. They're being kept in place by arms shipments and money from the West. How much longer will those be able to be continued? Well, one sign is that the U.S. Army announced plans for what they call a dramatic increase in the production of artillery shells, tripling the numbers produced over the next 3 years. The Army's chief weapons buyer said funding is already in place. And he added that they can double the supplemental budget to do that. Well, again, doubling these budgets for weapons when there's no money for infrastructure, education, healthcare, and the debt is crushing state and local governments and the national government? Well, we'll see. In the meantime, there are meetings underway in Washington between bringing in the defense and foreign minister of Australia to meet with their U.S. counterparts. And it's also likely that British Defense Secretary Ben Wallace will be there. The discussion will be the AUKUS nuclear sub-agreement and plans to turn Australia into essentially an aircraft carrier for future war with China. Is this what the Australian people want? Well, let me hear from you. Let's hear what is, if this is a willing price to pay to bankrupt the country in order to carry out the global NATO plans against China. Now, one other ominous development to keep in mind, the Bank for International Settlements released a report on currency derivatives. Now, we've long pointed out that the derivatives market is a time bomb because it's essentially an extension of betting contracts with virtually nothing to back it up. Well, the Bank for International Settlements is now concurring with our assessment. They're saying that the short-term debt coming due is not possible to roll over, that it's too much. And they called it a time bomb. So we'll have more on this probably tomorrow. But this is part of the collapsing of the old order. And finally, a diplomatic story which indicates the extent to which the ability to dictate policy by the West is being lost was the deployment of the junior varsities Annalena Baerbock, the foreign minister of Germany, who went to Delhi to deliver the marching orders to the Indian government, essentially to tell them they shouldn't do deals with Russia, they should join the Europeans against China. But her mission failed, and it was clear from a joint press conference she did with the foreign minister of India, Jaishankar, who was asked a question by a German reporter about India's purchase of oil from Russia. And essentially, this is one of the lines from Europe that India should not be purchasing Russian oil, should be breaking with that, and so on. And Jaishankar said, he pointed out that Europe imported 6 times more Russian oil than India and 50% more Russian coal than India. And he refused to accept a condemnation of Russia over the war in Ukraine. And what he said is that he always asked, will you condemn Russia for annexing the Donbass? And he said, it's up to Russia and Ukraine to decide. So once again, the Indian government, as one of the leaders of what's the new non-aligned bloc of nations coming together, rejected this strong-arm attempt. This is not the first time they've been targeted. Boris Johnson went, he sent a whole group of officials to India to try and pressure them. Blinken himself went, and now they're sending the junior varsities Baerbock, but to no good purpose. Now, there's a reason for this. India is one of the leading nations in the breakaway from the unipolar order, away from what Blinken calls the rules-based order. On December 1st, India assumed the presidency of the G20, and Prime Minister Modi gave a very strong commitment to moving away from this old unipolar order. His comments are really quite interesting. He started by saying he will use his position as president of the G20 to, quote, catalyze a fundamental mindset shift to benefit humanity as a whole, unquote. He went on to say that humanity has lived under conditions of scarcity, fighting over limited resources, and remains, quote, trapped in the same zero-sum mindset, unquote, to this day. But that can change now, he said. We now have the means to produce enough to meet the basic needs of all the people in the world. That should be the agenda of the G20 process. Not wars, not division. He said we can do this. And he went on to say, some may argue that confrontation and greed are just human nature. I disagree. If humans were inherently selfish, he concluded, what would explain the lasting appeal of so many spiritual traditions that advocate the fundamental oneness of us all? Now, he wrote that India's G20 presidency will work to promote this universal sense of oneness. Now, this is very similar to what Helga Zepp-LaRouche laid out in her 10 fundamental principles, and I'll get to some developments on that in just a moment. Now, at the same time, the well-known Russian economist Sergey Glaziev sent out on his Telegram channel Helga Zepp-LaRouche's 10 fundamental principles of a new strategic and financial architecture. And he wrote, quote, these are good suggestions by Zepp-LaRouche on the principles of transition to a new global security system. So this is something which is being discussed widely around the world, not in the US, because in the US and in Europe, you live under a dictatorial circumstance of censorship and mind control through the media. Now, what else is going on? China's President Xi Jinping is in Saudi Arabia today. He'll be addressing a meeting of 30 nations, the China-Arab Summit and the China Gulf Coordination Council. And they'll be discussing broad cooperation between China and nations of the Middle East. The Saudis are a particular problem for the West because after serving as essentially a gas station for many, many years for Western countries, the Saudis are not willing to stick their necks out as a partner in this unilateral order of Wall Street and the City of London. So this is part of the transformation underway. It's all about Eurasian integration. It's about the potential to bring Europe out from under this unipolar order into cooperation with the nations of Eurasia, the African continent, and so on. In other words, a thorough break with the colonial system, and that this is where you see the potential for a new system in which sovereign nation states cooperate for mutual benefit, as opposed to subordinating their nations to the dictatorial demands of the unipolar order. This is what's outlined in Helga Zepp-LaRouche's 10 Principles. And very interesting, she was the guest of one of the leading talk shows in Russia, the Solovyov talk show, which I'll have a link to that at the bottom of the description page, where she laid out what the potential is to break from this unipolar order. So, give up your despair and also give up your fear. Russia and China are not about to take over the United States and impose communism on the United States. The American people wouldn't accept that. But what we would accept is a return to the principles of the American system in cooperation with other nations which are adopting those principles, while the elites in Washington instead are clinging to a British imperial tradition that we defeated more than 240 years ago in our War of Independence. So get with it. The world is moving, and so should all of us. I'll see you again tomorrow.